Hey scholars, welcome to chapter 8.4. We're looking at freshwater ecosystems this time and really about what ecological services, what economical services they could provide for us, as well as our impacts on freshwater ecosystems. So that's what we're going to get started with today. We're going to look at two different main categories of freshwater ecosystems. And the first one is what we call a standing body of water, or a lentic ecosystem. And that is lakes, ponds, inland wetlands, any sort of aquatic habitat doesn't have very much flow to it. The water is not really moving. We call a lentic body of water. The second category is the lotic systems, and I always remember this because flow rhymes with low in lotic. So flow and low go together. So those are the streams and rivers. Some that have a little bit of movement to them. They have some sort of current that the water is moving from point A to point B. Those are called lotic systems. Those are our major two types that we're going to explore today. The first one we're going to look at is the lentic systems and how they form. There's kind of a couple different ways they can form. One of them is through glaciation, where literally a glacier chunk has broken off of ice, has made a depression, eventually melted and formed a lake. There's crustal displacement, where literally the crust has moved to form a depression with other movements, where the water would congregate, or even volcanic activity, kind of changing the shape of the landscape to eventually have depressions and hold water as well. I might throw a YouTube video up on the bottom below this video that kind of shows about formation of lakes. There are four basic zones, and they're all based upon depth and the distance from the shoreline. And we're going to explore these four: the littoral, the limnetic, profundal, and benthic here in just a quick second. But before we do that, let's talk about the ecological and economic services that freshwater systems provide, and we'll kind of compare those to marine systems. A bunch of them have very similar, like climate moderation, nutrient cycling, waste treatment, flood control, habitats for many species, genetic biodiversity, scientific information. But the one ecological service that they all differ in is groundwater recharging. And that is, that you just can't. That's a good thing for us because we can't drink salty groundwater, and most of the water that we drink comes from the ground. So that's a huge ecological service as kind of well as an economic services in one. But the economic services are a lot similar too, except for a few. Food, transportation, recreation, employment, but drinking water, irrigation water, those are very specific to freshwater ecosystems. You can't drink salt water, and you can't really grow crops with salt water. So freshwater ecosystems are very vital as far as those two categories, as well as hydroelectricity. Now this one's kind of, they don't mention, your book doesn't mention it to you, but marine ecosystems, with the tides, can be used to harness hydroelectricity as well. But we most often associate those with flowing rivers and streams that are turning a turbine and generating electricity. So those they can be used for that with tides, but mostly associated with freshwater ecosystems. And transportation corridors, transportation from point A to point B, from country to country, happens with marine systems. But we also can connect bigger waterways and connect areas. Like the St. Lawrence Seaway, generating actually a corridor between the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes of Michigan. Caused some problems, but also did really well for economic services too. So those are just a few examples, and also some issues with ecological services and economic services provided by freshwater ecosystems. So let's dive right in today and take a look at the different types of zones of a lentic system. And the first one we're going to look at is the littoral zone. It's located right here. It's the one closest to the shoreline. It has lots of different types of things, like the painted turtle and the green frog, that both require access to land. Pond snails, diving beetles, yellow perch, that require cover, and lots of runoff, things that are coming off from runoff, which is great for diving beetles and pond snails to decompose. And then when you get out further away from the shoreline, you see this is the limnetic zone, still with lots amount of sunlight coming through. And can hold plankton, phytoplankton specifically, muskrats, blue-winged teals, ducks, northern pikes. Limnetic zone is very, very used by very many organisms. Then you have the profundal zone, and that is kind of that midway point, kind of the middle of the lentic system. It also has a thermocline, just like the marine systems had with their middle zone, or their twilight zone. And the profundal, it's very unique. This is one, if you were out in the marine ocean, you can't dive down far enough, at least with your own body, without some sort of type of equipment to actually get to where you actually feel, or most people just don't feel the thermocline. But in a lake, you really can. I've lived in a lake my whole life, And you literally, your boat's floating in the limnetic zone out here in the middle, and you can pencil drop, like dive down in pencil style, and literally drop down. You will feel in your toes, and it'll rush up your body the cold water when you drop down into this profoundal zone, because the thermocline, that temperature drops very rapidly, and you literally feel like you're hitting a cold body of water, and it rushes up your body as you go even further down. It's kind of a unique feeling. So if you ever get a chance to do it, check it out, and then you can explain what that is. It's called a thermocline. And then you have your benthic zone, which is at the bottom, very, very similar as far as organisms go and things to the abyssal zone of the marine system. We just call it something different. The benthic zone houses bloodworms and different decomposers to break down whatever falls through the water column to the bottom. There's also 3 different types of lakes. And some lakes have more nutrients than others, which means they have a higher net primary productivity. The first lake we'll talk about is the oligotrophic. Oligotrophic lake is how you say that word. And it really has very low levels of nutrients, very low primary productivity. So not a whole lot of algae, not a whole lot of plants. Very crystal clear blue lakes, beautiful to swim in and look at and swim around in. Then you have your eutrophic lake, which has very high levels of nutrients, high net primary productivity, lots of algae and plants associated with this lake. Then you have a lake that's kind of in the middle. This might be moving towards a eutrophic lake, but it's kind of a oligotrophic, doesn't have a ton of algae. Still able to be swimming in this lake, and that's what a lot of our lakes are, at least where I grew up at, were mesotrophic lakes. But a lot of lakes that you see now are mostly eutrophic because of this factor right here, the cultural eutrophication, which leads to hyper-eutrophic lakes, which basically means there's so much algae and plant life that it almost consumes everything and doesn't even become really a lake anymore. And this occurs because of the fact that we're of farm runoff and all the the fertilizers that we use, from golf courses to farmland, all run off into these lakes, and they really become what we call more eutrophic. They might have been very oligotrophic at one time, but because of so much nutrient runoff, it's causing algal blooms, making that lake more eutrophic. So let me show you a couple pictures. These are just a few images. This is an oligotrophic lake, beautiful crystal clear blue water, versus this almost looks like, if you look at it real briefly, it almost looks like a field or a green from a golf course, but really that is thousands to millions of duckweed plants covering the surface. You can see some pond lilies back here. Very, very eutrophic. Lots of primary productivity, lots of harnessing of photosynthesis and solar energy, but not one I would want to swim in, that's for sure. So let's take a look at lotic systems now, the freshwater streams and rivers, and we're going to look at kind of all the stuff that's associated with those. Most freshwater streams and rivers get their water from surface water runoff, precipitation, melting of the ice, and mostly coming from runoff and kind of draining to a certain area. Anytime you have water draining from a bunch of different locations or flowing from different locations to a certain location that eventually drains to the ocean, we call that a watershed or a drainage basin. And there are 3 basic zones that kind of make up this watershed. The first one is the source. Actually, I'm just going to go through it and just explain it by the image. But the first one is the source zone. It's this one up here, where there's rain and snow, maybe a little bit of ice melt. There's some lakes holding some of that water, but eventually it's flowing out down from the high elevation to lower elevations. Very cold, very small, narrow rivers and streams kind of flowing in the source zone. Eventually, they all drain kind of towards. They're coming together and connecting in this what we call transition zone, where the rivers get a little bit wider, they get a little bit warmer, and they're moving down in elevation, and eventually leading out to the floodplain zone, where they're all really connecting and then dispersing out into the ocean, and sediment with it, carrying a lot of, because of all of them, there's runoff coming from here, all on the sides, also with the melt, so it's getting bigger. It's also bringing more sediment with it and bringing it out into the ocean. And so that's what those are the 3 major zones of the lotic system. There's a case study that we're going to talk about. We kind of already mentioned it back in chapter 14 with natural disasters, but Hurricane Katrina came through Louisiana in 2005, and it caused some major damage, mostly because of man-made levees and dams breaking. And that's really what caused all the flooding, which really caused a lot of destruction and the loss of lives as well. In those coastal areas, they have mangrove forests and deltas and wetlands, and those are natural protections against storms. But because we built up Louisiana and we used our man-made things like dams and levees to kind of hold back those waters and flooding waters, that didn't really hold very well for us. The man-made ones definitely failed compared to the natural ones. That's where we had some of this devastation that you see in this picture here. Kind of sad and scary to look at all in one. But this is even a scary image in my mind. I know it doesn't look as scary or realistic, but if we look at global warming and with global temperatures, that's kind of the train of thinking with science right now is that global temperature is rising, and if it does, that means that the ice caps are melting. You probably heard the issues with the polar bears and all that stuff. Well, if the ocean raises by 1 meter, you can see all that in red, which is kind of scary to look at. Would be underwater. So a lot of Louisiana would be lost. New Orleans definitely gone. Houma, Lafayette probably underwater. Lake Charles, all that stuff becomes part of the ocean, which is kind of scary. But that's just something to think about. There are some freshwater inland wetlands that we'll talk about, some different types. There are some differences if you didn't know, but marshes are different than swamps, and marshes have grasses and reeds and a very few amount of trees, and swamps have more trees and shrubs than they do grasses. Prairie potholes are caused by, and most of these you haven't heard, but prairie potholes are depressions caused by glaciers that eventually form basically like lots of grass. It looks like a field, then eventually fills with water when big rains happen. Floodplains, known for what they're for, heavy rains and flooding, kind of at that floodplain zone that you saw in our last image of our lentic ecosystems. And then also the Arctic tundra in the summer, because the permafrost, which is held under the ground, melts and actually has a little bit of layer of water covering it, along with some sparse vegetation. These inland wetlands provide a lot of the same economic and ecological services as our marshes or our saltwater marshes and our mangrove forest did. They filter, degrade waste. They reduce flooding and erosion. They have lots of biodiversity, food and timber, recreation. But the one thing that they do help do is replenish streams and also recharge groundwater aquifers, which is what we get a majority of our water from. The last thing we're talking about with freshwater ecosystems is how we have impacted those and what things can we do to do better with those. And the first one is that we've used, because we want to use it for shipping and transport, and also energy. We've dammed and diverted the flow of water and rivers, and that can cause some major problems for organisms that require that high flow of water, as well as maybe they're trying to get to a certain place instead of branching off and going a different route. We've used flood control levees and dikes and dams along rivers to hold back waters. That definitely changes the route or the way the water is flowing, which can cause, again, problems for organisms. We've polluted not only from cities that are on these freshwater ecosystems and then draining to a certain spot, but also because of farms and the runoff from fertilizers and pesticides. And then even impacting of draining wetlands. That's been a big issue with us, is actually just filling in wetlands and draining them and then filling them to build homes. And a lot of this loss of wetlands has led to increased flooding and drought. These wetlands are there for a reason, to hold water or to deal with lack thereof. And a lot of our wetlands are lost because we're taking the land to either grow crops, because it's got a lot of nutrients in there. We're mining. It's great for oil and gas extraction. Maybe there's a couple good forestry in there for different types of trees that are good for wood. Building highways to get from point A to point B, maybe even fill in for urban development. And if you look around Jacksonville, unfortunately, there's a lot of places that have filled in wetlands. Now, in the next couple upcoming chapters, we'll talk about how this is legal and talk about what the legalities behind it, the logistics of it, and filling in wetlands, and how are they able to do that and why and so forth. But we'll save that for different chapters. So that's the end of chapter 8. See you guys next time.